Hi everyone, this is Allan McKay, and I wanted to put together this two-part video on something I thought that would be really interesting to touch base on, which is creating fire. But more importantly, having complete control over your fire as it spreads through the shot. So being able to literally paint where you want your fire to appear, as well as control the timing very easily through a set of controls to allow it to burn in the areas you want, easily through keyframing helpers to activate it all. This way came about as I was approached to do a project with a director I've worked with a few times now, Marco Brambilla, who's directed good old films like Demolition Man, and this was for an art installation in London where they wanted to create a fire burning through the building on security cameras. They weren't really designed for looking up close, so I just had to come and do some basic fire for the shots, no smoke or other elements, which in hindsight I think would have been a bit of a better choice to do entirely in 3D rather than heavily working on the elements in comp, but the project itself turned out pretty good. The main thing was that when I initially had the call about the project, as usual, I asked a lot of questions about the deliverables and what they're expecting, because at the time the only reference I had been given was a single frame of footage. The project itself sounded pretty straightforward until I asked how long are these shots actually in duration, and which at this point it gets really interesting because we were looking at creating several minutes of fire, and I said that right, several minutes. So each shot was typically about 1,000-1,500 frames. So until this point, the longer shots we've worked on were about 2,000 or 2,500 frames, and typically always Robert Zemeckis films, which he loves doing long continuous shots. I've worked on a lot of rides, game cinematics, and that sort of stuff where, let's say first-person shooter games through the eyes of the player, like Bioshock, things like that, where it might be one continuous cinematic, but typically whenever the camera pans away, you can cut the shot. But doing something like this, it wasn't just going to be a long shot, but it meant that I had about 7,000 frames of fire to simulate with a pretty tight turnaround for delivery. So for me, I didn't want to be running long sims, seeing the result, changing it, re-simming it over and over and over to get the look I wanted. So I needed to plan out what I wanted and try to lock down the look very early on before I really did any fire at all, and be able to show something that we could discuss and lock down the timing, placement of the fire, and again without any real simming. Because to run these sims we're going to look at taking a few days to simulate, and I wanted to nail the look of every shot on first take. So in this video, part 1, we focus on the look dev, creating the fire, the look of it, locking it all down, and building it in a way that we're ready to then plug it into part 2 of the video, which is where we'll control the timing, the motion, and specifically where on screen we want it to burn. So look, this is definitely more of a theoretical lesson, more communicating the ideas, which I think are really important. To understand that planning ahead, rather than just diving into a shot, you can really build a workflow that allows you to save time rather than just being busy and firing at sim after sim. Almost all the shots here I was able to run one sim once and get it approved rather than extensively revising over and over to get the result I want. So I hope this is something that you find interesting. Obviously creating fire is pretty standard. I mean, I've seen terrible fire and I've seen good fire. If there's something that you're interested in, I can definitely touch base more on that, but for me the focus is definitely more on the planning and really kind of getting it in your head that you should be planning your shots out, not just diving in and doing things without really initially sitting down and figuring out the best approach and what the requirements are, because we can all get in there and start building and try and figure out the look as we go, but doing the planning up front is really what's going to be the most critical part to save you time and lessen the amount of mistakes that you make along the way. Okay, so I've worked on putting out a lot of content on different things, from smoke, explosions, different stuff, but fire is one of those things that there's so many different ways to do it, and I kind of feel like you can never do enough when it comes to creating realistic fire, okay? Because I see a lot of really bad fire out there, and the focus of this isn't necessarily on how to make really cool fire. It's actually something where I wanted to talk about how to choreograph fire. In other words, how to control, let's say in a shot, having fire that creeps up the staircase and starts to burn along the walls, and have it kind of realistically begin to burn this building up. And as I mentioned earlier, the task given was I need to create several minutes of fire, so that way you would actually see all of these different areas of this hotel begin to burn apart and burn down. And so to actually get this to progressively move over everything, you need to have a lot of control, and I needed to do this in a way where I could knock it out very quickly. So this here is a model that was built, I think it was in Cinema 4D. I basically supplied this as an FBX. Pretty simple model, but it matches, it does what it needs to. And this is a lock-off, so in other words, the camera isn't moving, so we don't need to worry about any parallax or anything like that. Well, not parallax, any parallax shift. So, tracking this stuff is pretty easy. Now, what we have is mainly just for holdouts and for fueling a lot of the burning. So it's pretty straightforward, but the tricky thing is that this is a pretty intricate model in terms of, like, if I were to control the fire burning up everything using texture maps, that's going to be kind of difficult considering the fact that this fire literally needs to go up these stairs and twist around, up the walls, up here, up the other staircase. We need to do a lot with this. So I would rather have kind of influences. I would rather have objects that I could animate and literally just animate them moving up the stairs to figure out the timing. Because I'm doing several minutes of effects, or at least typically in the shot I would be, I don't want to have to run the sim more than once, ideally. I don't want to run the sim and be like, oh, it moved too quickly, or I didn't quite get to this area. I want to be able to secure every step of the way what I'm doing and have complete control, so I can either showcase this to the director or someone else and they can say, you know what, change this, do that, or I can at least look at it and get a good idea of exactly what's going to happen before I ever set this off to actually simulate, because it may take a few days to simulate and I've got several shots to do. So naturally it's going to be a lot, and it's not something that I want to run a sim and say, you know what, I'd love to get a bit more fire over here, or I didn't really catch over here, or it creeps up too fast. How do we slow that down? These are all things I'm not going to have the time to actually do. So pretty simple geometry, but it does the job. It's accurate, it lines up, and my goal is to use this to generate my fire. So the goal right now isn't to choreograph this. I more just want to create the fire and lock down the look dev. So if this is for a production, before I go and start to do several shots in several minutes, I'm going to work on some variations of fire and showcase these and say, is this what you want? Now I'm just going to dive right into this and start to build up some flames and try and get the look that I want. Typically though, I would probably create a few variations so I could send them off and see what they like. When I was working on the teaser trailer for Warhammer the movie, Warcraft the movie, I worked in Warhammer as well, Warcraft. So when that was being announced at Comic-Con, we need to create a lot of fire for that, and I was creating fire that I thought looked photoreal. It looked great, so I was really proud of what I did. And the client came back and was like, yeah, that looks too real. We don't want that. We want more fantasy fire. And they started showing me examples of some like After Effects tutorials and like other like really simple fire. And it's one of those things that if you can put out a few variations, people can pick that stuff out rather than guessing. Because a lot of times if they say looks too real or looks this and that, it's not really going to allow you to pinpoint what you want. But if you can put out a few variations, that's going to allow them to say, okay, well, we feel it's 80% this, but we really like, example C because it's got more green in it. You can start to kind of put together all these examples to lock in what you're after. Okay, so first things first, I'm not going to worry about any of this, because actually the reason I want to show it in two parts is because the whole distribution and control of it all in itself is going to be really cool. So all I'm going to do is I'm going to create a flat plane, and this is going to be my emission object, and I'm going to hide everything else, and let's just focus for now on the fire. So obviously we're going to need a fume grid. Let's just drop this in. Okay, so one thing that I communicate a lot, and I might as well go over some of the stuff. Whenever I ask someone, hey, what's the resolution of your grid? A lot of times people come back and say, oh yeah, like 1.9, okay? So spacing here, I just want to really communicate this. The spacing is essentially a multiplier, okay? So if this was 50, well, let's say, yeah, this is roughly 50, then that's because it's being divided by 2. So if I were to set this as 1, it's going to be roughly around 100. So this resolution here, 97, 97, 72, that is your resolution. Okay, and I never go below about 150, just because the resolution you get is not going to be enough detail to calculate a good looking simulation. So whatever resolution I'm at, I'm going to divide with this value until I get a value that's at least 200, okay? And usually I go by the lowest value, by the way. So that means that right now, I would say roughly mine's 150, and I could average this, but I'm basically saying that my lowest value is 150. So I'm not going to go any less than that. And it's just going to be a good starting point. Now, the other thing, like I mentioned, is if we're using all this geo, using texture maps to animate and control the fire, it's just going to be a lot of work. And I want to be able to have like an object that I can animate to kind of get an idea of timing, that sort of thing. So I would rather use particles here. Okay, so initially bring up pflow, and let's just drop in like an empty flow. I'm going to rename this. I'm going to call it like PFS for particle flow system fire. And the main thing I want to do is I always set my viewport percent to 100% so it's accurate to the render. And I just increase the memory limit or upper limit so that way, there's no unexpected stuff later on. One of the common things is people start getting weird results where they're like, I'm emitting from frame 0 to frame 500, or let's say frame 50. And about midway through my animation, my particles stop creating even though I've set it to emit for longer. And just weird stuff like that where if you're not thinking about everything clearly, you're going to start like playing with your system and changing it, trying to troubleshoot stuff when all that's happened is it hit the upper limit and it stopped creating particles. All right, so it's just, you don't want to put yourself in a situation where things may pop up that you didn't expect, and it's such a simple solution, but you're trying everything but that one thing. So again, just protect yourself and keep this at 100% and a pretty high limit here. Now, I'm just going to do this as quick as I can, but I'm just going to drop a birth in for now. And we could basically say, like, this scene file is 1,000 frames. So, like, for this example, I'm not going to do 1,000, I'm going to do 100. All right. But in production, this shot is 1,000 frames. It's insane. So another thing is I don't use amount because I could get the perfect sim and it all looks good. And then they say, hey, don't change a thing. And I've had this before where they're like, everything about this, do not change a single thing. And then you just say, okay, we just need to add an extra 20 frames or whatever, or make it start 20 frames earlier. So you change this, and it actually will divide and split up the amounts based on the new amount that's being put in. So like on Blade, I remember we're doing a lot of sparks and embers, and they loved the exact positioning of everything. And unfortunately, with this way, whatever values you put in is going to extend or average out the amount of particles. So it's better to use a rate whenever you can, because this way, if you were to extend it 20 more frames, it's just going to emit 20 more frames. It's not going to affect the total count. So just simple stuff, but I might as well just throw this stuff in here because this is the sort of stuff that in production, when I'm supervising, I see it all the time, and I just figure, cut it off at the head. Point this stuff out now. All right, so setting a rate, whatever that might be, we'll go back to that. Other thing is I just need to assign is the position. Okay, so let's just drop the position in, and so now we've got particles being generated. And so let's give them a little bit of speed, just so that way they have some kind of initial velocity. So we'll set speed, and by default, our particle flow source, wherever it's sitting over here, we can see that by default when we drop it in here, everything always points down. It's kind of annoying. In fact, we look at rotation local. Okay, that's all zeroed out. That's fine. But like basically it's pointing down. Ideally we actually want it to go up. So I'm just going to give this a little bit of a boost going upward, but we're going to say reverse and give it a little bit of divergence, like 25. And this means we've got something at least to work with here. The main thing that I want to do is I want to start introducing some wind. And again, subtlety is really critical here. So I'm just going to drop wind. Just going to make sure I can actually see it. So there's some wind. I'm going to drop in a force. And let's do the 0.04. Give it a little bit of turbulence. I'm just throwing in numbers. Let's just see what we get. Alright, so that's too strong, but at least it's a good starting point. I'm going to bring my scale up a little bit. I always start with a frequency of 2. I kind of feel like if you go higher than 2, things become kind of erratic. But 2 is kind of like a good safety value for me that I usually start with. Everything's scale dependent, okay? So like turbulence, if it's going in a straight line, I can't draw straight on my Wacom, but your scale is going to make things arc. Okay, so the lower the value, it's actually the bigger it's going to be. But then the frequency is going to control how much that repeats. All right, so like essentially you can kind of get more of a repetition in there, and together you'll end up getting, you know, some nice kind of turbulent motion based on the scale essentially creating this arc, but then the frequency creating more of that sine wave effect going through here. And obviously the strength is how much it's going to affect it. Okay, so the higher the frequency, the more higher the repetition, and obviously the scale and influence on this all affects things as well. So when it comes to this, you could do a low frequency and it's going to be, you know, quite different. Same thing I could do even lower, and you're going to get more lines like this. Typically what I do when I'm doing turbulence is, if it's going upward, I'll add multiple turbulences, and they'll all have different scales, and that way you might get like a really big but subtle motion coming through here, but then you'll get a lot more kind of smaller motion breaking off of that. So as you get particles emitting, you're going to get some like really nice intricate motion coming from the movement as it, you know, grows up. So typically I use combinations of turbulences to do that. And then I love the Maya because you've got conserve, which kind of depletes the energy a little bit differently to drag, but you get some really nice kind of intricate shapes from doing that. Whereas, you know, unfortunately it's more just like a feature inside of Maya's original particles. But ideally what I'm trying to go for here is just to kind of get some nice particles coming up. I'm going to lower my speed a little bit. Let's try like that. And something like this is a good starting point. I'm going to introduce some lifespan, because the other thing, you know, and again, I'm kind of over-explaining this stuff, but it's things that I just see so often. But like, if you have a hard time picturing, like, I'm using particles to drive fluids, all you really need to think about is basically, if you have a simple source, which is that, you know, a simple thing like that, or an object source, so you have like, this is my terrible teapot, or genie lamp. So both of these, all they're doing is, like, a simple source basically is creating a circle, and it's emitting from that circle. Object source is doing it over the geometry. Particle source is literally just creating simple sources over every particle, which is why I prefer particles, because I have all this control over many of them all at once. But that's all it's doing. So as long as these exist, they're going to create fuel in the direction that you tell them to. But that's all they really are, is a simple source. Okay, so it's better just to kind of dumb it down and think about it that way, because that's essentially all they're doing. Now, with this, obviously I want this fire to be really contained. What I'm looking for is to create like nice creeping burning fire. So I'm going to use a texture map to drive this, for now at least. So I'm just going to drop in a mask. I'm still using the old school material editor, and I'm just going to drop in gradient ramp. Let's just assign it to this object, show it in the viewport, make it radial, and I want it to go from white to black. So white in the center, black on the edges. All right, something like that. And all I'm doing is I'm just trying to get like a more of an uneven, shape to it. And the main thing is I want to drop in a noise map, and I'm going to use this to break things up. So most important things, that way this is accurate, I'm going to use explicit map channel. And let's show this in the viewport instead. So my size, I'm going to make pretty damn small, like 0.08. Map channel is, the sizes tend to be quite small. And I'm going to adjust the high and low threshold, mainly get the high threshold up. I want lots of strong whites in there. Fractal, but let's kind of thin this out a little bit. All right, so the combination of the two, and I might make this a little less broken up, but the combination of the two together, we're going to get something like this, where it's more of a map, and we have a broken up pattern inside of it. So the cool thing is I go back to position, I can say, what am I doing? Density. Here we go. It's been a while. Density by grayscale. Now, it mightn't recognize that there is a map being applied. So if that's the case, I can turn animate shape on just for a second. Typically, that forces it to read the map. But if that ever is an issue, then a couple things we'll do. First of all, just for a moment, so I can really see what's going on. Two things I'm going to do. One is I'm going to turn off noise and swap these around. I'm not too concerned about this, but I just want to point out, sorry, other way around, that the map is in fact working. Typically I like to use birth texture, but either way, if this is ever an issue like this, all I really need to do is I'm going to cut my gradient, go to my noise, paste it in my white, and I think this is more of a graphics thing. So I did it kind of quick, but all I did is I pasted my gradient into the white slot. So it's layered inside of it, and I'm going to cut that, and I'm going to paste it in here. So I'll explain this in a moment, but sometimes masks are basically not really liked in the viewport. Okay, so mask is just one of those things that, for whatever reason, when it was built, it wasn't really built to show up in the viewport, and never really got updated. So it just doesn't always accurately represent what's going on. At least some certain things don't like it. So this way I'm going in noise, and I'm layering the gradient in there, and then we get that look that we're after. Okay. And so we've got that going on. You can also say delete particles, and sometimes there might be like stray ones that sampled wrong, and that just kind of gets rid of those. But this is just a good way to have something that we can start with, okay? Now, the whole goal of this is I want to use this to generate particles over time. So my lifespan of these, I want to keep really short. I want to make them 3, but I'm going to give it a variation of 6. So we still get some stray particles coming off. It's not really looking as interesting as it was a moment ago, but we can kind of get the idea now that we're going to have particles shooting in different directions, and they're all kind of sampling from that point. So I actually want to emit lots of particles. I'm thinking like 7,500, lots. Okay, so this way we got this really defined pattern. The particles are coming up. There's still more that I can do with this, but I just want to kind of get the basics going of this. Okay, but I want to build further with this. So once that we've got this going, I'm going to basically create a spawn. I'm going to generate additional particles that break off of these. In fact, we'll get into this in a moment, but basically emitting these originally, it's going to look good, but they're all going to be really consistent. So usually I layer in spawns, so that way I can get additional bits that break off of it, and we can have some pretty specific motion for each event. Okay, but let's just get this in the Fume and we can start to have a look at how this is turning out. So initially choose your output directory. I'm just going to leave mine as default. I am going to make sure that I'm emitting for only 100 frames. The resolution for now is fine. Couple of things, object source, really critical. Let's create a particle source in here. And I'm just going to select my particle system. By the way, and let's just choose event 01. I just realized I actually have, because I cleared the scene out, I actually have that there. So let's just kill my old one. But basically, we've got just a particle source, and we chose this event. Now I'm going to call this fire A. Let's just keep it simple. So fire A, so that's the first event there. All right, so fire A, and we can see that all of these are essentially just simple sources being generated, okay? Just like how I was saying, we've got these little circles everywhere. One of the key things I want to do is make these finer, so let's try like 0.6, all right? And we can throw in a bit of variation, but the main thing is just to get that up. Now, because these aren't moving much, I really just want these to kind of trail behind a little bit. And basically, I'm not going to launch them up too much, so the velocity multiplier, bring it back a little. I'm just trying to not make them violently shoot up, but rather just kind of push up a little bit. Now, there's not really that much I'm going to do in here. I mainly just want to set that up in a way that I've got something emitting. Let's run the sim. And again, all we've done at this point is we have a nice particle pattern to work from. But in terms of everything else going on, it's all at default values for the most part. Like I've made them kind of smaller, about 60% of what they were in terms of size. But besides that, everything else is pretty much the base settings that you would grow to expect with FumeFX. All right, so that's pretty much it. Also, a couple of things I'll mention is if you're ever finding your scenes are slowing down, drawing these spheres on here can get really slow, so it is better to disable them. It's just a viewport thing, but you'll notice if I turn all of this off, this draws really fast. Now, it is kind of slowed down a little bit, and you can imagine on a larger scale it can get a bit crazy. So I just want to mention that there. Other things are that you can enable GPU, but I don't know, I find in Max that the GPU preview window, it doesn't prioritize fire and smoke always the same way. So I find smoke comes up in the GPU really well, but fire seems to always draw, I think it feels like on top of it. And so for explosions, things like that, it can be really critical to get the ordering to blend together. So in those situations where with GPU, I just can't see exactly what I want to use, I tend to actually use the software instead, just because I find it just kind of draws a bit more accurately. You're not going to get shadows or anything like that, but I just feel I get a bit more of an accurate result. So again, these are just little tidbits I want to kind of throw in there. Maya seems to actually draw it a lot better, and I'm not specifically sure what the reason for that is. But yeah, I find Maya, you get all this really accurately drawing with GPU. So again, I just want to kind of mention that GPU isn't always something that I'll use. All right, so this looks cool, but you know, first of all, the fire itself is kind of bland. I don't care so much for the smoke. In fact, I'm not going to use smoke for this particular sim. I like smoke, but I'm not going to worry about it right now. I just want to focus on this fire. So for the sim that we're looking at right now, I'm just going to turn the smoke off. And again, you know, I assume you know how to do this, but rendering tab, you can enable, disable the smoke channel. But in the sim tab, again, I'm just quickly covering this, but under smoke, I just disabled generating smoke. So it's one less channel being calculated in here. And it means my grids are going to be much tighter, which will simulate faster. Okay, so the fire right now looks pretty bland. I want the flames to live longer. So to do that, I want to come down and I'm going to change my burn rate. And I'm going to actually bring this down really low. Let's say like 5 or 6. Let's say 6. Okay. Now, one thing by doing that, and I want to point this out as well, is that basically the way that the burn rate works is the lower the value, so burn rate BR, the lower the value, the less fuel is going to be burned. whereas expansion relies on basically how quickly the fuel is going to burn. It's going to be more explosive. So when you lower the burn rate, your fire doesn't burn as quick. So the fuel that's like sitting everywhere in the scene, the fire doesn't creep up and burn through it as quickly. So what ends up happening is it doesn't deplete it as quickly. So what ends up happening is your fire will end up being much taller because the burn rate takes longer to burn through that fuel. The problem is that because the burn rate is lower, it isn't as explosive, because the quicker it burns the fuel, the more it's going to go from a flame like that to being more of an explosion instead. Okay, and then it all comes down to basically your burn rate and your expansion. Okay, so the lower the burn rate here, the more that goes down, the more you're going to need to up your expansion. Otherwise, these flames are going to look really, really thin, rather than looking more like, we want them to, or getting explosive. So if there's ever times where you got your fire and you're like, oh, I feel like it looks really good, it's just the fact that it's way too big, like, it's way too round, something like that, you can lower your expansion, and that's going to tone it back. Okay, I know these circles aren't really making much sense, but essentially it's going to make it expand less, whereas bringing the expansion up is going to make it expand more. So I'm going to run a sim right now of what we have, which is a low burn rate. That's all we've really done here, is I lowered the burn rate, and we're going to see the fire lives a lot longer, but I have a feeling it's going to feel a little too stringy. It's not going to feel that interesting. Okay, so I want to probably play with my expansion a little bit. Actually, I kind of feel like this isn't too bad, but in general, if I wanted to, I could set my expansion higher, and what you'll see is everything will start to become more explosive and, essentially expand more. And the more you kind of play with that and the heat production, the more everything is just going to grow. And we can already see here the reaction. Everything's becoming a much more like a bigger fire. And in a moment, it's going to become a little bit too big, but you get the idea. Okay, so going back to what we had, everything is really low, and then we up the expansion, we see it gets bigger. Okay, I want to keep mine about 0.9. I actually like it how it was. It actually looked pretty good about there. The main thing is I want to start introducing some turbulence, start to make this a bit more interesting. I'm also just under burn rate. I'm going to adjust the variation, and this will vary things. Some will live longer, some will live less, and I think that will be really critical, just to try and get the look of it more organic. But the main thing right now that I do want to play with is, let's just give it a little bit of turbulence. Let's say half of that. And I usually keep my turbulence scale really small, especially for stuff like this where I want the high frequency look, because it's going to more make it feel like it's got more detail. Basically, it's going to help give a lot more subtlety. I don't want it to feel too soft. So I don't care about the motion. It's going to look like fire. I care more about just kind of making it move and have a lot more internal noise. So I'm going to make it phase a little bit slower. Again, number one thing I see is too much turbulence and the phasing too quick, so it kind of sizzles. I don't want that. So let's give it detail 5, which is just basically how many octaves. So if we're looking through here, detail of 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Okay, so that's just going to put more into it. And so it's going to phase a little bit slower, and basically it's going to be really small and a little bit of turbulence. Same thing, vorticity. I just want to try and break this up a little bit. Okay, and so this is looking pretty cool. I'm going to do a preview of just what we got. It's 50 frames. So this is a good starting point. I don't want the fire to go so high, because I can tell it's going to continue going up really high. So the next thing is I want to tone that back a little bit. So all I'm going to do to that is I'm going to get my temperature buoyancy. Let's just bring it down to 0.2, and it just means that it's going to move at 20% of what it was. So that I think is just going to help a little bit with not raising up too quickly. And besides that, I do want to, as I mentioned before, add additional bits that do go higher. So I want to break this up a little bit. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to add a spawn. third time's the charm, spawn. And I'm basically going to shift, drag, copy some speed over here, and let's just rename this to Fire B, just so we have a way to distinguish the two. Alright, and these guys for now is going to make lines. Now, all I want to do with this is I want to randomize this a little bit so they splash out a little, so that way we have fire going up, we have fire spreading out. So I'm going to set my speed to 2, vary it by 1. The main thing is I'm going to make this random horizontal. So all we get is we have some fire that's going to spread a little bit. Let me change the display type again. But basically we have some fire that's going to spread out on the ground a little bit. And that's just going to fill it in a little bit. So that way we have particles that are, let me set actually the divergence down to like 5. But we have particles that initially are going up, but then we have some that spread out, and it's just going to make it so that way the fire on the ground is more all connected, but then we have the bits kind of breaking off up the top. Okay, and obviously the lifespan, I'm going to duplicate this age, and the lifespan for this, let's set it to like 5 and 16. So we have some bits that live longer, but all in all, it looks something like that. Now the other thing is I don't want this to be everywhere, otherwise the fire is going to get really big. So this is going to be a real subtle thing, like 20% of what I currently have is probably all I really need. I just want to have some particles that are going to be expanding out in certain areas. And it's just going to help fill it out so we don't get that string look that we were getting. Now, once we do that, I'm going to add another spawn. Oops. And this is just going to mean that, there we go. So this is just going to mean that the ones that are being generated right now, there's only a few scarce pockets that get created. But then I want to go and I want to create more particles, let's say 20. And the whole idea of this is I'm going to have more particles being generated loosely around where the other particles are. Now, I don't want to inherit the motion as much. I want these to kind of feel like, let me bring this up. I basically want to feel like this. If this was the ground, I'm going to have a particle shooting up here. Well, I want it to generate other particles going along this trajectory. And these ones are going to basically hide a little bit behind it. Okay, so you're going to kind of get additional fire kind of burning out like this. And the reason is because the inheritance is less. So instead of it, let's say if a particle is here and is here, it's going to generate particles around this section because I'm going to set this to 50. Okay, so that way it's much less. And I'll vary the variation here by 50, which means that it's really going to average out points between 50% of, if this was 100, this is 0, this is the 50% mark. So this means that particles are going to be created here, but then because I'm going to put in 50 variation, it means that it's loosely going to generate them in around that area. Okay, and so that's exactly what I want to do now, and it just means that we have some of the particles are going to generate 20 additional particles, and they're all going to be around there, and it just means we're going to get pockets of particles. So rather than there being 1 or 2, we can see that there's actually multiple ones being generated from that. So we just get these stronger points of particles being generated. Again, trying to avoid that stringiness. And the more fuel being generated, the more temperature as well being generated, all of this is really going to help. The big thing is, on top of all that, is I want to introduce some drag. And drag is just going to decay the velocity. And the main thing is I want to make sure it goes for the duration of the animation. And let's just drop that in here as well. And the drag, all it's going to do is it's going to kind of tone back the additional particles being generated. So I'm just going to select my drag, drop that in. Finally, with the, so this just means that it's not going to spread out as much. So you can kind of see the particles shooting out, they don't really have the same kind of velocity as these other ones do. They kind of shoot out a little bit and they're kind of slowing down already. So it just means that they spill out a little bit. They're not really too active. The main thing that I want to do here is, let's say I might add another spawn. So I'm going to duplicate this one. Copy, paste, just because I seem to have the worst luck right selecting. All right, so we're going to spawn. This one, I'm going to give it more offspring as well. So again, it can fill it up. And yeah, I just kind of want to vary it a little bit. So I kind of feel like that's not bad. One thing I am going to do though is delete the parent. And I'm actually do it for both. And all it does is it means it kills the old one and replaces it with the newly created ones. And it just means that it'll reset particle ages or whatever else. But this is now what we're generating. We're getting something a little bit more interesting, because now we've got these clusters of particles being generated and they're kind of splashing out everywhere. So I kind of feel like something like this is going to be a bit more interesting to play with. Now, I got way more we got to do to this, but let's just take a look and to see how different that's going to be now that we've got something where they're not little dots anymore, because before we could see all the individual particles, but now we're getting something where we've got these clusters of particles being generated. All right, so this is looking a lot better. We still got way more to do, but the shape to me feels a lot better. It feels, a lot more interesting. So the one thing is the shader itself, and like this is really critical at this point, is to try and get more detail in here, because right now we got this very thick fire, which I'm not really digging. So under the fire shader, I'm going to right click, choose key mode, and then we got this, and so let's right click, hit reset. So let's just start with making this entirely black. And the main thing about this is I want to distribute just really fine fire into this, and that way it's going to give me a bit more of an interesting pattern. So usually I'm going to cap my work area to something like that. I'm going to really expand the hell out of this thing, so I've got so I can get as close as I possibly can to it. I think this is pretty important. So the first thing is, let's just set up some basic color. So right here, I'm going to double click this, and let's just make this, I don't want to make it like bright red. That's another thing that I see a lot of, is like people go for like these really strong yellows and oranges, and typically, we're going to pump the brightness and everything in comp. We're not going to do that in this lesson, but that's, a lot of color correcting. I want to go for lower values that I can punch up. So as long as I've got a good kind of range to play with. So in this case, I'm not going to go for like really extreme reds. It's like even something like that. I just want to get more of this kind of color. Now let me do this. I'm going to bring this back to black. And I do this a lot so that way I can ramp up the color here, and just try and get something that initially has a bit of a fringe, but just different values that kind of break off from it. So just essentially I'm going to get a lot more range of color, but keep it really sharp, okay, rather than just blending from one color to the next. So let's make this a lot brighter. Let's say it doesn't need to be exact values. I'm just trying to get something closely looking to what I want. But that sort of thing I feel pretty good about. Now I want to transition this color though to be more of kind of like the goldy kind of yellow orange fire. So again, I don't want to have my brights too extreme. That's pretty good. And finally, we just make this die down over time. But let's just take a look. I mean, you can kind of see here how this is affecting everything. this is pretty common how I always do it. I had someone recently in a live webinar I was hosting asking me about like explaining the gradient more and maybe putting together like a lesson on that, because typically I use the same gradients a lot of the time and I've shared a lot of that stuff publicly. So if you haven't already gotten my gradient files, I have like large libraries of actual film projects. I've shared all that stuff. But for me, like I didn't see, the need to go too in depth on this, just because, it's pretty straightforward to set this stuff up. There isn't really an art to it. I just kind of play around until I get what I want. But typically I don't want to blow out the colors. I don't want it to blend too much either. So I like to get really fine, a bright here, dark here. Those ranges really kind of allow you to see more detail. Again, I'm doing a really low res sim right now, but it's just more about setting this up in a way that I've got a lot of nice range to kind of play with. Finally, I'm just going to throw one more in, and let's just make this pretty subdued. So I'm going to, bring it down a little bit. I'm going to push the red. Actually, let me just bring the greens down. All right, so that feels pretty good. I think mainly just trying to play with the positions at this point. So we'll make this really tight. I'm going to do one more and just make this black. So, I mean, just throwing something together, it's going to give us this kind of look. I kind of feel like that is pretty good for what we need. Okay. Now, definitely more to do with this, but the main thing now is I think I'm going to start to have to play with the detail, just because right now the detail is so low. It's always going to look muddy. It's not going to look very good. And no matter what you do, if you don't have detail, it's not just voxel detail, but the motion is all calculated within that as well. So next sim, let's just bump this up a little bit. Also, don't just ever jump from like one res to the next. Don't ever go from like, all right, well, I'm simming this at 200. Now it looks good. I'm going to put it to 2000 and expect to get the exact same result. Just because one is going to be like this many grid, and then this other one is going to be so fine that what it took for a voxel here to get to the end here might only take 10 frames, whereas here the velocity is going to decay over the amount of voxels it goes through, as well as other things being introduced. There's so much more going on in a high detail grid than a small one. You don't get the same result. So it's better to work incrementally. Like right now I was at like 200, now I'm going to 350. Later I could go up to like 600. I wouldn't want to go higher than 600 at the very most for fire unless I was really close. But I don't just jump up to a setting from 200 to this and expect to get the same result. So again, it's just really critical when I do get asked that sort of thing. But point 3, I feel like I can get an okay sim, something I can play with, not be final, but something I can play with out of that. But the main thing is I just want to start seeing the shader, the motion, the placement, all this stuff, just have a feel for how it's all going to look now. And of course, later I can kind of like really pump up the in the comp, I can get everything else going. But for now, I'm going to set my color to to 5 and the opacity 1.5. Color can be pretty exponential in terms of like it'll blow it out pretty quickly. So I always find like if you want to make it slightly brighter, more dense or anything, do it in the opacity. The last thing, okay, if we look at our gradient, we'll notice it goes from dense being the luma value of 130, to nothing, and then back up. So we have basically, like, I'm just looking down here. Right now, this is going to have like a curve like that or whatever. If we look at this, what's actually happening is if this is high, this is low, this is coming in about mid-range, and then it's dropping down to low, then it's spiking up, and then it's gradually going back down. Okay, that's pretty much what this ramp here is doing. So it starts out bright, but it's not too opaque, but then it spikes to opaque and then back down. So rather than using the color curve here to try and mimic what my colors are doing, I'm doing that in my colors. So if I want, let me just close this. I'm just going to right click and disable this. And we'll see now it all got really sharp, okay? Because rather than using the opacity here, I'm actually using my color gradient, and I tend to use most of the time my color gradient because I can control the brightness to say I want it more opaque here, and make it darker to say less opaque. All right, so I wanted to wait to show that just because I wanted to show the difference, especially doing a higher res sim. But I like how this is looking, and already I kind of feel like this is going to turn out pretty well. So obviously the emission pattern, I mean, I'm not going to be burning like a big circle of, stuff, but in terms of the motion, everything, well, let's see the motion, but like the shape is looking pretty good. Overall, everything's looking pretty good. Another thing that I'm just going to jump into for a second is under rendering, gamma. Rendering, gamma. Alright, so I'm not working in linear color space right now, and the reason for that is basically the way that max atmospherics tend to double up in the gamma. So everything else renders fine in linear space, but I've always found that the atmospherics tend to double up. So I tend to keep this off. However, there is now a new feature under rendering environment. If you go to FusionWorks renderer, you can actually control the gamma here. So I can bring that back to counteract the fact that it's doubling it. So if I did this, it's dividing that down. It's going to make it go back to 2.2 instead of the gamma of the atmospherics being 4.4. It's just a weird, quirky thing. But the problem is in the viewports and everywhere else, it doesn't do that, which is just a little bit confusing. So don't worry about what I just said, but if you ever do want to or need to work in linear color space, which I do recommend, linear is always the way to go. It's just for atmospherics, I'm not finding it always is the best for Fume. So if you do need to work in there, I don't, because I'm rendering 100% just fire. I'm not doing an entire shot. Like if I was doing the lighting, rendering, everything else, I'd want to make sure it's all balanced correctly. But yeah, it's worthwhile knowing that just to understand, especially if people are like, why aren't you in the right color space? Yeah, basically, why are you not working the way everyone else is? And the reason is because atmospherics can come out a little bit ugly when it comes to that because they gamma up twice. All right, so this looks good. I'm going to check out the motion, but from what I can tell, I like this. And by the way, here was one of our original frames with the new shader. So you can kind of see where we were and now where we are. So the fire itself kind of moves a little bit slowly. That's like one thing to take into consideration. Is right now it's moving kind of slow, but the motion, everything looks really good. I like how it looks. Obviously, it looks really noisy. That's just the FumeFX renderer. We've actually rendered it. It'll look fine. So overall, I like this. Just the fact that the detail, the motion of it isn't quite there. So I'm going to put my time scale to 2. Only thing is that, and this is critical as well, but basically, if you're going to play with your time scale and really bring it up too high, then you should set up your minimum sim substeps to at least 2. And that way, if it needs to, if it's finding that it's kind of getting ahead of itself, then it can kind of take a step back and do it correctly. Again, I might as well just point this out. Obviously we have frames. I mean, this is stuff that we all know, but it's worthwhile going over. As we sim through a frame, basically if this is moving too quickly, so it jumps from, like, if this was the voxel here and it jumps here, it mightn't it might be doing too much in between this negative fuzzy space here, in between the two frames. So it sends it from this frame to this one. When it gets to this one, this voxel is like, well, I don't know what the hell happened. It's, I've got way more different information than I did the frame before. It's, too hard for it to keep up with the next frame. So bit by bit, things start to get really haywire as they step through, because it's just too much going on for it to keep up. In other words, we're trying to get fire from here up to here and do this crazy turbulence, and it just gets really, really chaotic. So what you typically will want to do is basically have it emit or calculate in the middle as well, at least once, and that way you're going to get a much more stable result, rather than seeing stuff kind of like look very staccato and it's kind of really weird. You'll get like much smoother, much more accurate results. And since Fume 2 and onward, the max simulation steps, it's more a suggestion. It isn't going to enforce it. Max 1, if you set this to 2, it's going to take twice as long. 3 would be 3 times as long. Whereas now you got min in 4, min and max steps, and it's all based on your CFL condition. So your CFL is basically calculating between 5 voxels or whatever you put it up to be. If it's going to move further than that at any given time, then it's going to enforce this. So if you were to set this to like 10, for instance, that's a bit more forgiving. You don't need to set it 5. 5's pretty sensitive, but I do recommend having sim substeps on, because you're going to get smoother, more what is the word I'm looking for? More predictable results in those situations. And again, if you want, like, set it to 2, but if you want, you can say, okay, only if it gets really crazy, but it's up to you. But basically that's something that I am pretty careful of. I'm also going to bring my max iterations down a little bit. These are just ways that I can kind of hopefully get faster simulation times slightly. Now, I don't think there's really much more to do. We could play around with Fume 4, how we have oxygen. We could play around with the vorticity and to scale it, but I like what we got. I don't think we really need to change anything else in here. What I saw looked good. It's just the fact that it was moving too slow. And other than that, I'm just trying to think again what I can do. I'm going to render out a frame of this now, just make sure that there isn't much noise or anything like that in there. So I'm not concerned about lighting or anything like that, just because I guess I'm doing progressive, but just because this is fire, it doesn't need any lighting. So I'm just throwing this in. I'm not too concerned about that. And I'm not trying to do any production settings here. I just want to get this off of progressive. So adaptive. So yeah, like I said, I'm not concerned about that. I just want to make sure I'm not getting any noisiness in here. But this looks good. I'm happy with all of this. So at this point, like, we got enough color range without it being like too blown out or too extreme. There's a little bit in there, but again, we're rendering like 16-bit EXRs. So I think at this point, I'm going to run a sim. We can take a look, but if the fire looks good, the next phase of this is going to be to actually distribute it through the shape, which to me is the more important part. But I figured I'd cover at least some of what we're doing here. But to me, the most important part is going to be doing the control of making the fire burn around like the spiral staircase that we have here, or essentially what it represents. Okay, so this is what it's turned out to be, which looks good. That's the old sim there. So, and I just switched camera angles. So, I mean, this is what we're going to be looking at from here, right? This is from this camera angle. And overall, I mean, the fire, I mean, it doesn't, depending on the look we're going for, I think this looks fine. The biggest thing is just making sure I've got enough range so I can color correct this later on. Okay, so here's a preview, just a bit closer up, but, and again, it's not the entire thing, but we can see how this turns out, and like I like what we got. This is a render. This is actually of what we're basically imitating, but you get the idea that basically this is the entire look where we can see fire burning as it progresses, the whole thing. So let me just cap this a little bit. And yeah, so the color range for me is the big thing, because typically a lot of fire that we see, we don't have enough range and enough variation, so everything kind of just ends up looking very CG. There is bits of this that I'm not a huge fan of, and that's just more the way it progresses up the stairs a little bit, just because you're getting so close to it. It's not that it looks wrong, it's just the fact that, first of all, we need smoke, and I'm not doing smoke in this element. So without smoke, it's just always going to look weird when you have perfect fire generating without nothing else in there. And the other thing is that I would imagine some heat distortion, some marks on the ground. Like, there's a lot of additional elements we can build that we're not doing right now. So as a raw pass that you've even taken the smoke out of the element, it's going to look a bit odd. But if we focus on the areas that are not like front on, like face on here, the fire itself looks really good. I'm happy with how this looks. So like I said, the next phase of this, I mean, I wanted to just get us to the point where we have fire set up. And we've done it in a way that, like, we have no fancy system in place. We literally just have fire emitting on the ground, but we don't have individual elements where we end up with those weird kind of long strings of fire. We actually have a good system. We get these clusters, which tends to work a lot better for the flames and creation of them. Now, the next part of this is going to be where we start to actually choreograph the fire, like in this scene file here, where what ends up happening is we're able to build very specific areas and see where we want it to burn. So the end result is, rather than being really specific, like, sorry, other way around, where we just have like fire burn up all the geometry, we're able to actually create exactly where we want all of the fire to be. So I can actually say, okay, well, I want the fire to burn up these walls here in a pretty natural looking way. And it's all based on what we've created so far, using that look of the fire as it burns across. So this is basically what we're going to be doing in the next part of this as we move forward, is being able to choreograph like exactly where we get it to burn. So I just move through that kind of quickly, but you get the idea, where you can see it progressing on in those areas that we specified. So obviously this is over 1,000 frames, but you get the idea of like being able to see this happen and burn and control it all. And like I said, I don't want to have to sim this multiple times. And just in general, having that control to get kind of fire organically burning in the areas that we want, that to me is like what I really want to kind of focus on. So now we'll move on to that part of the lesson. Okay, so I hope you enjoyed the video so far. This is part 1 of 2, as it's a very big lesson. Part 2 for me is where it gets really interesting, so I'll see you in the next video.